Welcome to our latest Danube Dialogue podcast. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, and my guest is Marek Matraszek. Marek is the president of a public affairs consultancy in Warsaw. However, Marek, our viewers will know right away from your accent and mine that we were born in neither Hungary nor in Poland. Can you give me a little bit about your background?
Well, a great pleasure to be here, John. Thank you so much for welcoming me to the Danube Institute, which I've always been delighted to come and visit whenever I'm traveling. You and I are exiles, in a sense. I think we're exiles from our own native lands, and I think we're also exiles from our cultures as well, where we found a home much more congenial to ourselves in Central Europe than might otherwise have been. My parents were Polish. They came over. My father actually came over during the war to Scotland initially, and my mother came over in the late 50s, and I was born and raised in Surrey and attended British schools, universities. But as the revolutions in Central Europe occurred, and I'd been traveling into Central Europe from the mid-1980s onwards, meeting with the then dissident underground anti-communist communities in both Hungary and Poland, it seemed like a natural step to actually come back to the land of my parents. And I've spent a very happy 30 years so far in Central Europe and in Poland, and as you correctly note, setting up a public affairs company, which is rather well known in that little niche of business that I'm involved in.
Actually, you mentioned your work with the anti-communist underground, with Solidarity and others, while the communists were still running Poland. And I think you were working there, weren't you, with Roger Scruton, the great conservative philosopher who died only 6 months ago.
Well, Roger was remarkable in many ways, and one of his remarkable aspects of his life was that he understood that ultimately the values of civilization that he felt were under challenge in the West were to be found here literally in an underground form. And together with a small group of other British academics and intellectuals, Baroness Cox, Dennis O'Keefe, Jessica Douglas-Hume and others, set up something called the Jagiellonian Trust, which at that point in the 1980s was set up as a UK charity to support independent culture and education in both Poland and Hungary. And together with Roger and his team, we set up a network of contacts both in Poland and Hungary who received assistance, mainly intellectual assistance in the form of visits by philosophers, writers, academics from the UK and from the US actually, who would come and give covert seminars and lectures. And we also supplied literature, books, printing equipment. It was quite an organized activity. And it was designed really at a very basic level at that point, keep the intellectual flame alive. Nobody at that point expected communism to collapse as quickly as it did. And of course, when it did, our task was sort of complete in one sense, but in another sense it continues to this day, because Roger, as you know, for the last 30 years of his life devoted much of his time and energy to continue to come to Central Europe and to find here the things that he found so valuable.
Well, as a matter of fact, you and I first met in the period of the middle 1900s and 1990s, I should say.
Were that to be the case?
No, 1990s.
I wish it was.
And that was because we worked together on something called the New Atlantic Initiative.
Yes.
And that was, I think, quite important in getting the Visegrad countries into first NATO and then subsequently the EU. A big battle, by the way, which in Washington certainly, because there were some very able leading figures in American politics who were strongly opposed to it. And I know that, for example, the work of the initiative actually had an impact on them. I, for example, had a dinner with Jesse Helms, who was expected to oppose the expansion of NATO, but partly a result of the conferences we held and the discussions, he swung around actually. And,
well, I think your role, John, in sort of initiating that initiative, I think was absolutely crucial. Funny enough, I was under lockdown, I was sorting out my library, and I came across all the documents from the Arizona Congress I believe, in 1997, which was held during the month of August, which I remember was only through the fact that we stayed in a hotel all the time. But on a serious note, I think that was a remarkable period because, in a way, it was a culmination of some of the work that you and I had done earlier on in the 90s. And the New Atlantic Initiative, together with other initiatives in Central Europe, came together, brought together what you might call the Atlantic community. On the one hand, those in the United States who recognized that at the end of the day, both NATO security and American security was deeply linked to bringing in Central Europe into the sort of defense orbit of NATO. And that also with those in Central Europe who recognized not only that their membership of NATO was in their own national interest, but it was also in their national interest to make sure that the United States remained engaged in Europe, in NATO, and in Central Europe as well. So it was a unique combination of circumstances where on both sides, and there were skeptics. Let's be honest, both in the United States and within NATO, and even within Central Europe, it was a battle on both sides to persuade not just the elites but also the populations. And the parliaments, because a lot of the work was being done also in the Congress of the United States at the same time to ensure that NATO expansion would be voted through. And so the NAI was absolutely a pillar of that effort.
Yes. Actually, one of the interesting things about that effort, in retrospect, is the degree of support on both left and right of politics. I remember, for example, our host in the Congress of Prague that launched the initiative was Václav Havel, then president. Margaret Thatcher was one of the speakers. We, as I say, we had a number of Republicans and Democratic senators. We had the head of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, over here at the conference. So things have changed. There's no longer that kind of bipartisan view in either America or in Europe, is there?
Well, yes. I mean, that's the whole issue of bipartisanship, I think, is now... there the choice was very clear. It was really about securing Central Europe from a renascent Russia. There were ethnic issues in the Balkans. I think there was a great sense that the common interest of security was something that people could unite around. And there was still, I think, a grander consensus on the values that were being supported, both left and right, actually, from today's perspective. In the 90s were different from the left and right today. And I think what united the left and right in the 90s was a common sense of civilizational inheritance, a broad acceptance of the rule of law, an acceptance of liberal values understood as the freedom of expression, freedom of association, these things which were, and the freedom of debate. I think that was another common plank. Now that has shifted markedly, but then that was something which brought together very disparate people on both the left and right of the political spectrum, and similarly actually in Central Europe. I mean, funny enough, although in Poland, if you take the example of Poland, their NATO membership was in the mid-90s was driven by the government of Jerzy Buzek. There was a grand political consensus involving even the post-communists. And on EU membership, that process was driven entirely by the post-communist government of the early 2000s, but with the support of the then opposition. So on both of these historical objectives of coming into NATO, coming into the EU, you had that cross-party consensus in certainly in Poland and I think in the other Central European countries as well, and similarly on the recipient side, as it were, in NATO and the EU. It's an interesting thought experiment whether we'd get that grand consensus if things were to be happening today. I suspect not. Well,
as a matter of fact, at the conference held in Lithuania, at which the Lithuanians led the Baltic states and a lot of other and Eastern and Central Europe with an appeal to enter the institutions of Euro-Atlantic cooperation, NATO and the EU. I remember a kindly French diplomat putting his arm around my shoulder and walking me around and saying, around an exercise yard and saying, you know, young man, I was then somewhat younger, you know, they're not going to have more than one of these countries getting in anytime soon. And I said, but there seems to be quite a strong moral force to enlarge both the EU, and this was NATO, of course, which you may not be able to resist. And he was polite, but he dismissed this. But of course, that turned out to be true. And I think that's one of the interesting things, that particular, there were real West European versus East European tensions, but they were overcome by the desire to bring the Eastern and Central European countries into NATO and into the EU, but also to do so as a way of establishing stability. Now that's no longer there, is it, or it's breaking up?
Well, I think it's a very interesting observation that in that anecdote, which is at that time in the 1990s, this urge to join the institutions of the West by the Central Europeans was obviously seen in the case of NATO in security terms and in the EU sort of economic terms, but it was primarily seen in civilizational terms. This was very much a moral civilizational impulse that the nations of Central Europe felt they had to return to the West, understood not just in terms of those institutions, but also as the civilizations rejoining the civilizational order from which they felt they had been historically expunged as a result of Yalta and the post-war divisions. And this moral urge, this urge to rejoin the civilizational orbit of the West, I think was what really drove it at the end of the day. Now, since then, of course, that's fallen away, and more the various conflicts and debates and issues we're seeing are now driven much more by sort of down-to-earth security and economic interests. But that's always been there, and I think that's one of the failures of the West is to understand what a real well of moral strength there is here in Central Europe, and it remains to this day.
So let's go to something that just happened very recently, 10 days ago, the result of the presidential election in Poland, in which the incumbent President Duda was returned for the Law and Justice Party, narrowly defeating the Civic Platform candidate. Now, my first question, therefore, has to be, this was a narrow victory. What does it presage for the governing party? I mean, is it now going to feel it's got to make concessions to half the country, or does it feel it's now got 3.5 years, really, before the next election, in which it's able to pursue what kind of policy it wants, and what would that be?
Well, it's actually very difficult for an incumbent president to win re-election in Poland. It's only happened once before by Alexander Kwaśniewski in 2000. And to understand the success that Duda achieved, you really have to look at two things. One is that the campaign was very bitterly fought against the candidate of the opposition, Rafał Trzaskowski, the current mayor of Warsaw, who was brought in by the opposition halfway through the campaign. It's a very complicated story, but as a result of the COVID crisis, the election that was originally scheduled for the 10th of May had to be delayed. They changed their candidate. And Rafał Trzaskowski, who's a very energetic, young, eloquent mayor of Warsaw, was brought in by the Civic Platform to run a renewed campaign against Andrzej Duda, very effective. He managed to really re-energize the electoral base of the party. He actually, interestingly enough, did not run overtly as the Civic Platform candidate. It was more of a civic movement that he tried to sort of mobilize behind himself, and he came very close to defeating Duda. They came within a couple of percentage points at the end. But Duda's achievement is all the more remarkable because on the one hand, he was the incumbent. He was on the back of already an existing 4-year term by the Law and Justice Party, so you could say that it was much more difficult to sort of get that energy up again. But what was remarkable was the turnout. It's the second highest ever turnout in any sort of election of any description, whether European, local, parliamentary, referenda that we've had since 1990, or well over 68%, which is a lot in Poland. And in terms of numerical votes, he got almost 10.5 million votes, which were votes which were, again, the highest number I think any candidate has obtained in any election since 1990. And you've seen at every election Law and Justice since it started to achieve its political successes from 2014 onwards. This is the 7th election, taking into account local, presidential, parliamentary and European, that they've actually won in the last 5 years. So they're on a roll. And at each point, they're racking up a greater and greater vote. And there's a reason behind that, because Duda's campaign, as you rightly alluded, was very much around mobilizing. There was a debate, as you often get in election campaigns across the world. In order to win a majority, do we tack to the center, or do we try to mobilize our sort of core base? And that's essentially what the Duda team decided to focus on, was to mobilize their voters, which are unashamedly rural, provincial. In terms of demographics, they tend to be more on the elderly side of the scale, perhaps less university educated. But as the election showed, they are actually a majority in the country. And it's very interesting also to see the electoral map of Poland over the last few years. Together, Duda and Law and Justice have been encroaching more and more towards the west of the country, which were traditionally the strongholds of the Civic Platform Party, which is, in this election especially, was really shown to be very much an urban-focused movement, where the electorate is very highly concentrated in key urban metropolitan areas. So this division of Poland, sometimes it's wrongly described as an east-west divide. It's actually more of an urban, rural divide. And much as you see in the United States, you look at the electoral map, you see those east and west coast strongholds for the Democrats, and the sways of the Midwest are going Republican, very similar in Poland. So you get the same phenomenon. The key now, of course, for the big challenge for both the ruling party and the opposition is what happens next. Duda will be trying to and the Law and Justice will be trying to sort of maintain and build on that majority that they've obtained. And the big debate in the opposition now is where do you go on from here? Have they hit a glass ceiling? Or is it a philosophy of one more push? We'll just give it one more push at the next election to get a majority. There's all sorts of debates going on about where the demographics of Poland are going. That's a deeper issue. But certainly the next 3 to 5 years, because bear in mind we're not going to get an election of any description in Poland before the end of 2023. That's where that debate will be on both the government and the opposition side.
I don't think we should be too focused, and I don't mean you and me here, but the world shouldn't be too focused on demography in this case, because for the last 30 years, we've been expecting an emerging democratic majority to rule in the United States. It's always seemed on the verge of becoming, in a sense, the natural party of government, and it may happen, but it hasn't happened on the schedule that everyone expected. So my question, therefore, is what are the issues here? Because we get the impression, you mentioned the urban-rural divide, but my impression is that economic issues were not a big area of dispute in this election. Between the economy and culture, broadly defined, was in fact the dividing line. And I'd like you to explain to people who don't know Poland, what are the issues on both sides of that divide?
Well, it's a very interesting question, John, and I think there's a dynamic going on which I think is going to be a challenge to both Law and Justice and Civic Platform in the next few years, and I'll come to that in a minute. But you're right, this election, especially was driven, and Duda was successful and his team was successful in setting the agenda, which was very much a combination of, on the one hand, defense of the welfare programs that the Law and Justice Party had put in over the last 5 years, which, as you know, were highly redistributionist, were geared towards welfare programs targeted at the poor, large families, the elderly, pensioners. And so there was a defensive aspect of that, of saying we will continue to protect this, the welfare state, essentially, approach to economic management. But on the other hand, also unashamedly civilizational. And of course, if you read the Western press, you will see that Duda was very criticized by Western media for the campaign he ran, which was unashamedly defensive of family values, church values. There was a critique of the LGBT movement, and there were other issues focused on a very clear Eurosceptic approach. There was criticism of Western media influence. So he's unashamedly traditionalist, robustly conservative, and not a little with a fairly unashamed tinge of nationalism as well on the Duda side. And that was countered by Trzaskowski, who ran a campaign explicitly calling for a return to European values, a more integrationist approach of Poland into the EU. And of course, don't forget that President Duda also played literally his trump card when at the peak of the campaign he went over to Washington to have a summit meeting with President Trump to demonstrate that very strong Polish-American relationship that he's been leading on over his presidency, and the issues of US military presence in Poland played heavily in that, and the energy relationship and so on. So it was seen very much, but it was played very strongly by Duda in civilizational terms and economic terms. Now, but to go into your second question, which is on the economic side, this is where it gets interesting. Because if you look at, there's a very interesting phenomenon going on, which is this rising support that you're seeing for, which today is still a fairly minor political party called Confederation, which is hitting about 8-9% in the opinion polls. They have a very dynamic leader called Mr. Bosak, who ran a relatively strong campaign in the first round of the presidency. And they're attracting, there is, as you were saying, there is perhaps a sort of simplification in talking about demographics when people say, well, it's only the elderly who vote for the right in Poland. But if you look at Bosak's electorate and that of the Confederation, it's very heavily youth dominated. And the young people, particularly the 18 to 24, 18 to 29 electoral demographic, is actually very strongly looking to Bosak and the Confederation, which is very nationalist, very Catholic, but also very, very libertarian and free market in economics. And I think this is where the interesting dynamic is going to take place over the next 5 years for the ruling party, because there's a clear sense that particularly amongst young people, amongst entrepreneurs, and there's an increasing sense of frustration at the overly statist approach of the government on economic policy, issues on taxation. There's great concern about the degree to which rewards are skewing towards the elderly rather than the entrepreneurial. And I think this is going to be the big challenge, is who captures that young entrepreneurial vote. And I think this is the debate within Law and Justice now. Are we going to spend the next 3 years trying to pile on even more welfare benefits to the electorate that we've already got? Or are we going to try and design something to appeal to the more young and entrepreneurial? At a time when, bizarrely, the civic platform, and we saw this during the campaign of Trzaskowski, in order to try and get up that mass of votes, actually started to abandon some of their hitherto liberal free market policies and aping some of the welfarist policies of Law and Justice, and moving into a sort of social democratic direction on the economic side. So what we'll see over the next 3 years is, are we going to see a revival of that aspect of economic policy, which a lot of people thought Poland, there was no room for in Poland, namely a more free market, openly, unabashedly pro-entrepreneurial policy. And will that policy be voiced by Law and Justice? And if not, will it be captured by the Confederation? And will that help them gain even more votes in the 2023 parliamentary elections?
Well, on economic policy, I've always argued, and let me ask for your comment on this, that what matters is not the popularity of a policy, but the popularity of its consequences. If you have a free market policy, it may be unpopular, but if it produces the goods, you'll win the election. So you may comment on that, but my second question I want to add to it is this. I look at the election results in Poland, and I'm reminded in one major respect of the British election results last time, which put by an even much larger majority, actually, a conservative government into power securely for the next 5 years, 4.5 now, if it wishes. on the one hand, but in which all of the major institutions of culture and the society, the media, the universities, a lot of the governing quangos, the atmosphere and ideas of the civil service, all of these things are still very much in the hands of people who are culturally liberal. And so the question for the Tories is, how are they going to govern against that strong force in their way? Let me ask the same question about Poland.
Well, long question. Again, I think you really can't compare, because we've had, as you've seen in the UK, there's been a really big shift in some of these institutions that you've mentioned over the last couple of decades. In Poland, I wouldn't put it in so dramatic terms. I think on the media side, I think you will see criticism of the Polish government's policy on media. However, if you look at the entire media landscape, it's very pluralistic, actually, if you include the internet, the radio, television as well. There's a great plurality of views. And certainly in higher education, I don't think you've seen that degree of modernity creeping in, as it were, in education. So I don't think you can really compare the two. I think the problem in Poland, well, perhaps it's a challenge, is how do you get effective governance? And that's where some of the real challenges are, I think, in Poland today.
Last question on the Polish elections. From the outside world, we hear that the major problem between Poland and between the European Union, particularly the Commission, and the rest of the world, really, and certainly the international media, and what you might call the international leftist bien-pensant opinion. The question is there, or has there been in Poland, an unjust extension of government control of the judiciary? And I mean, the government says not, but how would you judge that? And secondly, how will you judge that is going to play out?
This has been really the core area of dispute, I think, that we've seen in terms of commentary analysis of Poland, is to what extent the government's reform of the judicial system is or is not a breach of rule of law, and to what extent the judiciary is becoming a instrument of public of political influence. And the government's position is that the reforms that were initiated by Law and Justice were essentially an attempt to restore public confidence in the judiciary. The arguments of Law and Justice was that both in terms of the organizational issues, the inefficiencies of the court system, the complexities of the court procedure required a revamp in order to energize the process of lawmaking. In other words, to restore to the ordinary people faith in the efficacy of the judicial system. And that is a separate issue which I don't think anybody could dispute, that the Polish court and judicial system, certainly since 1990, has been very inefficient and very unsatisfactory. It's the cause for a lot of dissatisfaction and frustration, particularly at provincial level, at the lower court level. The second issue was the extent to which Law and Justice claimed that the upper echelons of the judiciary needed to be revamped because of what they claimed to be links to the old communist judicial system, and judges which were of communist provenance still in places of influence. And that's a much more delicate issue, because there are certainly arguments to say that yes, there was an overhang, as it were, of the old system which was not cleared out in the early 1990s. To be fair, there's been a lot of turnover in the judiciary since the early 1990s. So that aspect of the ideological debate is much more divisive in Poland. Now, what inevitably that has done, whatever you may think of the right or wrongs of that reform, it's been a very easy stick with which to beat Poland. And if you are opposed to the government, if you are not a conservative, if you are frustrated that your people have been losing elections 7 times in a row, it's very easy to take that issue of judicial reform and to use it as a way of mobilizing opposition to the Polish government. And it's not helped, I think, which I think is a separate problem, is reporting from Poland, which tends to be, does not pay enough regard to the nuances of the debate and presents sort of a very Manichaean, black and white picture of Poland. That hasn't helped either in rational debate. But as we've seen in the recent negotiations over the EU budget for the next financial perspective, that issue has now inserted itself into the way in which there's been an express link has been sought to be made between the budget of the new financial perspective as well as the recovery plan being linked to rule of law issues. But as I said, it's very controversial. In defense of the government, I think you can say that in several high-level constitutional cases, issues which are politically controversial, they haven't been going the government's way in many of these cases. So it's a hard argument to make that the entire Polish judicial system has suddenly been somehow politicized.
Well, key question here is, if those judgments haven't been going the government's way, what has been the government's reaction to that? Have they in fact accepted the judgments of the court?
Well, yes, I mean, they have.
Implemented them.
There's been very little evidence of any specific attempts to commandeer the judicial system for political purposes. And we'll see how the next few years play out. I think one of the debates that we're now seeing within Law and Justice after the re-election of President Duda is to what extent this judicial reform process should be continued. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the new insertion of the rule of law criterion into the EU funding mechanism for Poland acts to stymie that, or whether there will be an attempt to ignore it. We'll see.
Well, I'd like to actually switch to the discussion of what has just happened in Brussels, because, of course, it's been a major event. I think, unusually, the conference meant to last a day and a half, lasted 4 days, several times.
Second longest ever.
Yes, several times. The day ending at 5:45 a.m. the next day. And obviously, an enormous decision was made. And I'd like to ask you in a general sense if you would describe what you think happened. But perhaps you should begin by, responding to this. You said that the rule of law question, in other words, are Poland and Hungary in contravention of the rule of law and more vaguely of European values? And if so, what should be the response of the European Union to those alleged infractions is one thing. Were they, as you said, inserted in, or were they not in fact also taken out by the agreement? I mean, that's an important question, isn't it?
Well, as a long-time observer of the EU, John, you will recognise that the one principle that is constant in these negotiations and agreements is that of fudge, which is a way of ensuring that whatever agreement is made, it's one that not only is acceptable to all 27 member states, but one can be sold to the various domestic audiences as a great success. And I think, as often is the case, the wording of the final agreement is such that it remains open to interpretation. And I think we'll see through the practice over the next 12 to 18 months how the specific phrasings of that linkage is interpreted. And as we all know, it'll be a function of political interest at any moment rather than any sort of stable interpretation that can be made. I think essentially what the both sides of, I think what Prime Minister Morawiecki and Prime Minister Orban can legitimately say is that the very explicit link between the funding mechanism and the rule of law is no longer there. There is a procedure that has to be initiated, and it's on a couple of levels, which at the end of the day, given the level of political interaction that has to take place, it's not at all clear whether ultimately any sanctions can actually be specifically implemented. And on the other side of the coin, yes, there will be those who will say that now there is now a stick with which the EU and Brussels can beat Poland and Hungary on, as well as the carrot of the economic largesse that these countries can potentially have access to. But ultimately, remember that the European project, especially post-Brexit, in order to succeed, in order for this recovery program to succeed, it really needs Poland and Hungary on side. And there will always be a limit to the extent to which Brussels or Paris or Berlin will want to push these countries to the edge. So there's room on both sides, I think, for, as is often the case, muddling through. And we've seen this, for example, in the way in which the membership of Fidesz in the European People's Party has been treated. There's a lot of talk about expelling Fidesz. It's never actually happened. And the same with Poland. Poland is too big of a player, both economically, in terms of its importance as a market, its position vis-à-vis Russia, the whole issue of energy. There are too many things that Poland is involved in for Brussels to push Poland to the edge. So I think at the end of the day, yes, there will be perhaps a greater sensitivity in these capitals on these law and order, these rule of law issues, but there will also always be an understanding, I think, at the end of the day, that an accommodation will be found in order to keep them within the European ambit.
Let me suggest that the accommodation is becoming more and more complex an operation. Before Brexit, these conferences were always the Brits taking a position which was their position, but also privately backed very often by people now called the frugals or the free market oriented countries, and sometimes, Central European countries as well on rule of law issues. And now the British have gone. It seems to me that has thrown a stone into the pond, and you don't have this neat division, but you have the following different forces. You have the Central European countries, the Visegrad countries plus. You have the Mediterranean bloc, which has obvious interests in getting more money from the centre because it's being asked to bear the heaviest burden of all in maintaining the euro. You have Germany and France who are pushing things forward all the time. And so all of a sudden, we don't quite know how these meetings are going to turn out. We used to know the British would make a fight, there'd be minor concessions, that would mollify them and perhaps the countries who are secretly supporting them, and then everything would roll on. But there's a reason why this particular Brussels meeting went on for 4 days and not 1.5, and why it went on several times till 6 the next morning. How do you think that's going to work in future?
Well, as you say, John, I think for a long time there was a sense that the only real division on the map was the old Europe versus the new Europe. And to be fair, I think through the initial few years after EU membership back in 2004 of many of these countries, that initial integration phase, I think that held true. But what you've seen now increasing is much more of a patchwork relationship. You have not only these new regional interests developing. You have the frugal states, you have the Visegrad states, you have the Mediterranean, and you have the very specific interests of both France and Germany, which are laws unto their own. Even they don't see eye to eye. But that is even more complex when you try to drill down. And you see that even in the Visegrad group, for example, there are differences emerging. Certainly between Poland and the Czechs and the Slovaks on issues of energy, on Russia, on China, on the transfer mechanism. There's all sorts of issues which are complicating. I think what the success of Morawiecki has been in the Polish government is they've suddenly noticed that Poland can actually gain a lot of success by chopping and changing its relationships, its alliances. They will align with Germany, for example, on the US role within Europe. They will align with different countries on energy policy. They will align on different countries on Russia. And I think that Poland is seeing that it can actually achieve some of its sort of strategic aims by being able to sort of choose the allies which they work with in Europe. I mean, the loss of UK, I think obviously is a blow to many Polish interests because of the role that the UK used to play in terms of being the anchor for the US relationship, the anchor against an overtly federal project which the French would like to proceed, and perhaps a measure of a much stronger measure of support for the Polish position on energy and Russia and so on. But it's also an opportunity now, I think, for Poland, and you're increasingly seeing that without the UK, both France and Germany are now looking for Poland to fill in some of that vacuum. There's a revival, for example, an attempt to revive the Weimar Group, which is this trilateral arrangement between Poland, between Warsaw, Berlin and Paris on strategic issues. And we'll be seeing more of that. So again, it goes back to your original point where at the end of the day, Poland especially, I think is too big a player in Europe to be excluded from Europe.
I think that's right. It's also right, of course, because Poland still has a reasonably healthy birth rate, and so someone's going to have to provide the soldiers.
Poland is actually almost the economic powerhouse of Europe. It's the country which you look at the economic statistics, not only has it been until this year, this very unfortunate year, the only country in the EU or even within Europe which never had a year of negative growth. The economic decline as a result of the COVID crisis is going to be the smallest in Poland, and the recovery is going to be the quickest. So again, Poland has shown that in many ways it's no longer the begging boy of Europe. It's now very much more in the role of an economic driver, and that's very important for economies such as the German economy.
Just two more questions. The first is about America. Obviously, we've been talking about the impact of Polish elections, but the impact of the US election is going to be comparably, greater, but not only for America, but also for Europe. And do you think that we're going to see the Atlantic Alliance remaining strong, becoming stronger, or becoming weaker?
Well, undoubtedly, under the Trump presidency, there's been a bilateralization of the US relationship with Europe, where the Trump administration has looked to forging very strong bilateral links with certain countries, with the UK, and with Poland especially. And we've seen that reflected in a great intensification of the defense relationship. There's been intensification of dialogue on energy, on other issues, and less of a reliance on a relationship between Washington and the multilateral institutions, especially the EU, and to an extent NATO. That having been said, I think one of the things that has certainly happened as a result of the Trump presidency is a much greater engagement by the US in Central Europe, particularly in Poland in military terms and in energy terms. And yes, there are issues with the relationship with Germany, but overall, if you were asked Poles today, do they feel more secure now than they did 4 years ago? I think the answer will be yes. Now, what the implication of a change in administration will be for Poland and Hungary were a Democrat administration to come into Washington, I think that is a big question mark, because yes, I think you will see a definite re-pivoting of US policy towards a stronger relationship with the institutions of Brussels, certainly an attempt to repair the relationship with France and Germany. And on Poland, I think there is a lot of people within law and justice are quite fearful of a Biden presidency, because they think that this will be, it will presage a shift within the attitude of the State Department towards the way in which Poland is treated, and there will be issues which they fear will be raised at the bilateral level on cultural policy, media freedoms, rule of law issues again. And whether that very strong relationship will continue, whether it will become much more of a workmanlike relationship, I think that's a big challenge. But at the end of the day, any US administration, I think, looks at Central Europe and has to say, look, we cannot, this is an absolutely crucial part of our policy, primarily because of Russia. And the Democrats, as you know, have had obviously much more robust, a very robust line on Russia, already certain elements in behind the Democratic Party. So as long as the Russia threat is seen as a real challenge, the US cannot afford to abandon Central Europe. And I think that strong US involvement will remain. It might be tinged with more of a critical approach to some of these governments, but overall the interest of America, as is in fact the interest of Berlin and Brussels, is to keep Poland and the countries of Central Europe close within both the EU and NATO.
Yes. Well, I completely see that. My final question, we are in Budapest at the moment. Suppose that you were either Viktor Orban or leader of an opposition party in Hungary. You look at the two events we've been discussing, the Polish elections and the European Union agreement on funds. Do you think, what do you say to yourself? Do you say these strengthen me, these weaken me, these give me a good opportunity?
Well, I think certainly what we've seen actually very interesting in Brussels was the very strong bilateral approach of both Viktor Orban and Mateusz Morawiecki. They really played that game together because they knew the consequences of a wrong decision was going to hurt both of them, not just financially but also politically. The joint press conference, the effusive praise that Viktor Orban gave to Mr. Morawiecki. So that bilateral relationship between Poland and Hungary has been greatly strengthened. And I think both have realised that actually in practice this has exactly shown what we've been discussing earlier, that at the end of the day, Brussels, Paris and Berlin need Poland and they need Hungary. And they've shown that they do have cards they were able to play. The more visionary of, I think, the European leaders recognise that from their perspective, the federal project or the process of integration and stabilisation of Europe has to continue. And you can't have that if you were to suddenly implement a centrifugal force that would push both Poland and Hungary out of the picture. So they know that Brussels needs Poland and Hungary as much as Hungary and Poland need Brussels. So that sort of, I think, symbiotic relationship, I think, remains very strong, and ultimately that's the strength of Orban and Morawiecki.
Thank you very much. I've very much enjoyed our conversation. You come to Budapest at regular intervals. We've got to get you back. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, John, for having me. I very much look forward to my next visit. I look forward to you being on the Wisla River and not just me on the Danube in the future.
Thanks very much. I look forward to that too. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in and watching us. I very much hope you'll look at some of our other Danube Dialogues, which are available, of course, on the internet